Hello, viewers. Welcome to NatStrat Conversations. This is a show in which we bring you important issues of strategic and foreign policy relevance with thinkers and analysts. And we hope you appreciate this show and that you continue to follow us and join us and support us. Today, we have a special guest from Germany, someone who is renowned and highly perceptive in his analysis. He's a political analyst, a strategist, and a writer. I have been very impressed with his articulate expression of his views and perceptions about global affairs, and I'm sure you would also appreciate his eloquence. He is no stranger to India. It is my pleasure to welcome to our show today Mr. Marc Saxer, who is someone who has spent time in India, as I mentioned. He was the head of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Foundation in India for a few years, and today heads the Asia Pacific project of the FES. The FES is the oldest political foundation in Germany that is associated with the Social Democratic Party and therefore also to Chancellor Olaf Scholz. And one of the issues that we have to talk to him about is how Germany is transiting from 16 years of the rule of Angela Merkel to the chancellorship of Olaf Scholz. Of course, we all know that today Germany, like the entire European continent, is in the middle of is in the eye of a storm, and that's the Ukrainian and the Russian storm. So we will ask him about what he thinks of where Europe is positioned, how this is impacting the global relationships, and how it is impacting even the region we live in terms specifically of China. So let me begin by asking you, what brings you to India?
Well, as you said, I'm no stranger to India. I used to live and work here for a few years, and I do know that a lot of things have happened over the last couple of years, and I was hoping to get a refresher on where India stands today, what the strategic minds are thinking, and I think I got that. I've been here for a full week, and it's been a week packed with intellectual firepower and brilliance. Very refreshing.
So people say that India is transforming. That's one of the main impressions that it seems exist in the international community. Would you agree with that? I mean, what are the kind of changes that you detect or you kind of sense in India during this visit of yours?
Well, most certainly. I mean, India has been transforming for the past 3 decades. So I think rapid change has always been part of the India story. I think what has become more nuanced in the last few years is that, number one, India has readjusted its geopolitical posture. That, for me, was very clear in many conversations. And also, it is right now, when it comes to the macroeconomic trends, in a sweet spot. So, for the lack of a better word, you seem to maneuver a very difficult neighborhood quite well. And this gives you a lot of wind under your wings. So I think India is really moving in a pretty good direction, really fast.
Thank you. No, so before we go beyond and widen our kind of scope of our discussion, just briefly, how is Germany coping with its own domestic political transition, and what kind of challenges do you feel the country is going through in terms of the change in the political leadership and the whole internal kind of post the recent elections a year or two ago?
Well, maybe for the benefit of the viewers, allow me to go a little bit back. I mean, given Germany's very troubled history, we perceive the last 30 years after the end of the Cold War as probably one of the happiest moments in our history. So I think the Germans can be forgiven for wanting this situation where there was peace largely in Europe. We were, as we say, surrounded by friends. Economically, we were doing well. The society was largely at peace. enjoy this blissful moment in history a little bit longer. And I think it's fair enough to say that consecutive governments also were benefiting from this overall mood. So the appetite for reform in Germany, let's say, was not so high. There was, of course, thunder rolling on the outside. Think about the financial and then the Euro crisis. Think about the refugee crisis. Think about the pandemic, obviously, that hit all of us. And then, of course, February 24, 2022, the Russian invasion in Ukraine. So all of this radically changed, basically, the strategic environment of Germany. And a lot of us are waking up in a fundamentally changed world. In Europe, that is the close and most pressing situation, but also in the world at large, where we are basically looking at the beginning, at the dawn of a new world order. So if you allow me, in Germany itself, there is a series of shocks that have to be absorbed. If you think about what is the German development model that served us so well over 70 years, it's always been a combination of skilled labor, of a very innovative industry, of cheap energy, especially from Russia, and strong export-led growth. And all of these elements of our development model are under threat at the same time. So we have to wean ourselves off of cheap fossil fuels from Russia in a very, very short amount of time. We are worried that many of our export markets may freeze up. The German industry hasn't been this innovative for a few years, so there's worries that we are somehow losing contact to the technological frontier in the world. So this is some serious challenges that Germany has to address in a very timely manner.
Yeah, because Germany is the economic powerhouse of Europe, and not just Europe, but basically the global community and the global economy has traditionally looked to Germany to keep it afloat and actually to create these ripples of prosperity across regions. But today, of course, with what's happening in Ukraine, just to shift a little bit to the geopolitical situation in Europe arising from the events in Ukraine, how do you assess where we currently stand? How does the world look to you, both from Berlin as well as Europe? And I also want you to talk a little bit to us, to our viewers, about the internal dynamics within Europe, relating both to the future of Europe itself, as well as the kind of responses that Europe must or should make in response to the events in Ukraine. So just a little bit of a granular description of this internal dynamic within the European continent, as well as, in your opinion, keeping Europe aside, how does the world look to you as a consequence of the last 1.5 years in Ukraine? Because, in India, and I don't know about other countries, it's important for our strategic community and thinkers to be aware of these kind of differences or different perceptions or views within Europe, to be able to appreciate the real what is driving Europe and what is influencing its thinking, because this is a shock to European security, to the whole European security architecture that was built after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and also the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. So we've had about 30 plus years of a certain kind of an architecture. And then, of course, I remember we had discussed offline, and you had given me your views on the whole transatlantic alliance, but maybe that could come later on. But maybe first, if you could just focus a little bit on what I just mentioned about the German, European, Ukrainian situation, and how do you, and if you can tell us a little more about how this is playing out within Europe.
My pleasure. I'm not a military expert, so I think I'm not really qualified to comment on, let's say, the military situation as it plays out in Ukraine. There's a lot of observers who seem to believe that we are looking basically at a military stalemate. And let's see how that plays out. But if we look at it from, let's say, a larger perspective or a geopolitical perspective, you may make the argument that this war already has been decided last year. We do see that Russia seems incapable of reaching its goals and is paying a very high price for this invasion. So you may say that Russia has actually lost this war. On the other hand, the United States seem to be winning in posture. So you may argue that the United States won this war. China has also upgraded its global standing dramatically. It's being wooed as a mediator in a theater where traditionally had no sway. So China, I think, could be considered a winner of this war. And most importantly for us, Europe has lost this war. I think that is the most fundamental thing, is, as you mentioned, and that is the biggest issue here, the European security order as we built it, starting from the Helsinki Accords, and then, of course, with the Charter of Paris post-1990, a European security order where territorial borders were sacrosanct and could not be changed by violence. This has all collapsed in a manner of days, so to say. And recovering from that will take a long time for Europe. This has basically repercussions in all policy fields at the same time. Most pressingly, obviously, that's the field of defense, where Europe will, after 30 years of more like an intervention posture, will return to a territorial defense posture. That means you were looking at a fundamental rebuild of the militaries of Europe. Then we have obviously the pressing issue of energy. There have been dependencies, especially for Germany, but not only for Germany, that now have to be addressed in a timely manner in two ways. Short term, you want to address, of course, price hikes and energy shortages, but long term also there is the transition away from fossil into a renewable energy world that is now being accelerated. All of this brings, of course, lots of political and social and cultural repercussions. This means that we basically reconstruction, how we organize production, how we organize mobility, how we organize housing. And that, of course, has a repercussion for lifestyles, and that is, of course, one of the hot debates that you have right now in Germany. Is like, who is paying for that? The distributional question. How fast would you manage these kind of transformations? Who is in the driving seat, so to say? So these are the questions that in domestic politics, of course, now are the downstream effects, so to say, from this war.
Yeah, very, very interesting. I mean, the other aspect of this war is the role of the transatlantic alliance and what this has done to NATO as an organization, and the fact that in the Lithuania summit, Ukraine was not admitted. But on the other hand, we hear, for example, the French actually talking about strategic autonomy of Europe and so on. So any views on how the shape of this alliance is evolving, and is there any gravitas or any weightage in this concept of Europe's strategic autonomy? How would you read this?
Well, this conversation is, on the one hand, decades old, but it has a very immediate connotation, obviously. What is really old is that our friends in the US and our friends have a different perspective on, let's say, the architecture of the transatlantic alliance. This goes back all the way to the 50s, and in that sense is not very surprising. Also, we had decade-long conversations about the burden sharing within the transatlantic alliance. Our American allies have for a very long time basically reminded European allies that they need to carry a bigger share. And now with this new strategic situation, I think this all came to light. We do see that there is a very clear message from the United States that this burden sharing now needs to be addressed. The Americans have shifted their strategic focus away from the Euro-Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific. And I would assume no matter who is going to be occupying the White House after 2024, this is where the Americans are going to put their major capabilities. So that basically raises the question, how is the static of the transatlantic alliance being recalibrated? I think it goes without saying that the Europeans are going to have to pick up a larger share of this burden. And just again, this is something that people like us, strategists, like to discuss. But it is important to understand what that actually means in the political economy of a country. Going back basically to a Cold War posture of territorial defense. And let's say below the standing Article 5 premise that there is a transatlantic defensive community, right, that comes to each other's help if that's needed. That is a given. But I think, let's say, the day-to-day business in this vast arc of instability or ring of fire, that you may call it, that somehow starts with the security worries in the Baltics and Eastern Europe. We have a chronically unstable Middle East. We have all sorts of conundrums in the Mediterranean. We have the northern African states and the refugees, and we have the Sahel that is deteriorating very, very quickly. So, somehow managing the security and order implication of this will be on the shoulders of the Europeans. And that will have political economy repercussions.
So no discussion on this topic can be complete without talking about Russia. And we know that in 1991, a new country was born. There was a political earthquake in Europe, and we have lived through these 30 years of the Russian Federation as opposed to the Soviet Union. What will it take for Europe and Russia to find a modus vivendi to live together as equal partners, guaranteeing and respecting each other's security interests? Would you say that the hot war in Ukraine is a failure of diplomacy from both sides or from all sides? The reason I'm asking is because Europe in some sense remains the cockpit of global prosperity and stability. And we have seen very graphically how in the last 1 year the repercussions and reverberations of this conflict have been felt by the global south. And in fact, I would say that the global south, the street in the global south is up in arms. This is not the 50s and the 60s. And people are saying across the world, please find a way to solve these issues, which are in some senses fundamental. So what in your opinion is the path forward to be able to enable Europe and Russia to coexist in a manner that is stable, and we don't go through these periodic 30-year upheavals?
Well, I mean, this is obviously a very hot debate in Europe as well these days. I would say as long as this war is raging, there's just no way that you can go back to the status quo ante. Basically, some fundamental principles of the European order, especially when it comes to sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, have been violated, and that just simply cannot be ignored. So that means for the time being, there is just no way of going back of a cooperative stance with Russia. On the very contrary, European security for the time being will be organized against Russia. On the other hand, Russia is part of the European theater. It will not go away. This is, let's say, our geographic destiny, so to say. We have to find a way of dealing with Russia, but also Russia will have to find a way of dealing with the world, where it seems to be searching for its role very, very quickly. And Russia also seems to, shift its strategic focus away from Europe towards the Indo-Pacific. Let's see how it plays out for them there. It may not all be that golden, would be my guess. But I think that is basically the conundrum, that we somehow have to find a solution, but it's very, very difficult as long as there's a war. The repercussions are dire for the global south, especially when we talk about food insecurity, but also all sorts of inflationary pressures. And these inflationary pressures will arrive in the global south, but probably also in the south of Europe through the interest rate hikes that both the European Central Bank as well as the American Fed have been doing over the past couple of years. So this will create enormous pressure both on corporate actors as well as states with the view of the sustainability of sovereign debt. So I think we haven't even seen the end of the ripple effects yet. Which I think from a German perspective would urge that we start thinking about how we can actually exit this situation.
Yeah. So you had talked earlier about issues of deindustrialization of Europe, of Germany, of Europe paying a very heavy price in terms of decoupling from cheap energy, etc. So these are big issues which will actually affect the future destiny of Europe, and something in which India is deeply interested as a growing systemic power. But let me now shift to the Indo-Pacific and ask you about China and how Europe views China. How is Europe's behavior towards China vis-a-vis its attitude and its policies towards Russia? And how do you visualize and see the whole Russia-China equation? But more importantly, I think, how do you see China today and in the future? And where does China feature in Europe's or in Germany's strategic calculations? That is something which is, again, of direct impact and interest to India.
Well, I mean, I think no one in the world would question the fact that China is rising. And if a country of this size is rising to more than great power status, it will immediately have lots of ramifications for the global balance of forces as well as for the existing world order. I mean, any power would have that ramifications by its sheer size. Obviously, there is the first relationship that needs to be addressed is that between the United States and China. And my understanding is that there is basically a bipartisan consensus in Washington to basically have this strategic competition with China. So I think this would be one of the conditions that we have to operate in for the next, let's say, 1 or 2 generations. I think there is a strategic uncertainty that we all have to operate in. We have to make decisions now, even though we do not know how this is going to play out. If you look at the ramifications for the world order, in my mind, and looking from, let's say, an Indo-Pacific perspective, I think it is pretty clear that the unipolar moment of the Cold War is over, even though some analysts are fiercely debating that. But we do not know if the next constellation is going to be bipolar or multipolar. And then the more interesting question is actually, if there is a relatively new distribution of power on the global level, does this automatically mean that the multilateral institutions, let's say the economic as well as global governance institutions that we built in the last 75 years are not only contested as what we see now, but will become more eroded or maybe even obsolete? And I think this particular question for me is not clear. And I think in this particular questions, I see the most strategic convergence between Europe and India and other rising powers of the global south to say, yes, we need to adjust this rule-based order to the situation of the 21st century. It cannot be a rule-based order which was built for a world of 1945. But, you know, when in the end of it, we have a very strong common interest in keeping some of the rules of the road and some of the multilateral fora which we need to address these global challenges, from pandemics to climate change and so on.
Yeah, but before we come to that, there is a feeling here that even today, Europe's interest in the Indo-Pacific is far less than that of the United States. So if anyone is taking leadership in the Indo-Pacific region, it is basically the United States and to some extent France, because of its location and its kind of status as a Pacific and Indian Ocean power. Would you agree that Europe is somehow not yet as forward-looking on the Indo-Pacific region as perhaps the United States?
Well, I would say it's a little bit of a mixed record. On the one hand, we have very, very heavily invested economically in the region. So all this talk about decoupling, looking from a German and European perspective, is a worry. As I just said, we're just weaning ourselves off Russian energy. So decoupling, and we're talking about the Chinese market here, obviously, would be a second shock that I do not see how that could be absorbed. So in that sense, very, very strong investment in the supply chains when it comes to tech, all sorts of semiconductors and so on. But going back to the conversation that we had earlier about the strategic situation of Europe, I think it is obvious that Europe is going to be very, very busy keeping its own house in order for some time to come. So when we're talking about a security footprint in the Indo-Pacific beyond, let's say, the symbolic level, I think you immediately have to ask the question about capabilities.
Because, India is located here. We have our own dynamic with China. And so what happens in the Indo-Pacific region from a security and a strategic point of view is critical to our own national security. So I would say that on the one hand, if Europe is looking at itself and its region and Russia, India is much more focused on China and in the Indo-Pacific. So is there you would say, a strategic mismatch between how India looks at China and the Indo-Pacific and how maybe Germany and Europe are looking at China?
Well, I do not believe in the destiny of geography, but we also cannot ignore it. China is your neighbor and Russia is ours. And I think this kind of proximity will have immediate effects on the strategic calculus. I think that, as I said in the beginning, it's for me very visible that India is recalibrating its strategic posture. And that will not allow you to escape a very difficult neighborhood and all sorts of repercussions that are still yet to come. Of course, the biggest question that all of us, each and every individual on the planet, has to ask ourselves Is this strategic competition between the United States going hot? Is it going to stay cold? Or do we find some way of managing it? I think that is the biggest question. And depending on that, this will have, basically defining elements for our strategic postures.
Yeah, so if you are looking at the US-China competition, I remember you used the word, it's structural in nature. So if that is the case, then the options to actually ameliorate its impact on the rest of the world are limited to that extent, because if it is inherent in the nature of things and in the rise of China and the United States' determination to ensure its supremacy in the world, then the task seems to be cut out for other powers like Europe and India to somehow help or somehow contribute to which direction and the intensity of this competition.
Yes, absolutely, I agree. I think this is where the strategic convergence comes from. I mean, what do I mean with the structural competition? Obviously, 2,500 years ago, Thucydides already knew that if you have a rising great power and a relatively declining great power, conflict is unfortunately always a possibility, right? So that, I think, hegemonic element is there. But to be more concrete, I think there are some very highest level security interests, both from the Chinese perspective as well as the American perspective, to be considered. For the Chinese, they feel, and I try not to take sides here, but it's important that we understand these feelings, that they are encircled, and that a sea blockade, let's say in the Malacca Strait or in the South China Sea, would basically cut them off both from their supply lines as well as their trade routes. So everything that China has been doing in the last 10 to 15 years is a westward movement to get some strategic depth through the BRI, but also through CPEC and CMEC bypassing the Malacca Strait. And there is a movement to basically secure its immediate coastal waters in the South China Sea and push into the strategic depth of the Pacific. Now, if you look at this same phenomenon from the perspective of the United States, this would be the first aggressive military power that pushes into the Pacific since Pearl Harbor. So for the Americans, I think this is very important that we all understand that this is not some arbitrary line, but this is the first island chain is, from the American perspective, the first line of homeland defense.
Yeah.
So I think we all have to be very clear about what interests are at stake, because speaking from European perspective, I do not want us 100 years later to sleepwalk into another world war again because of some strategic miscalculations. That being said, I think for the rest of us, India, Europe, many other rising powers, middle powers in the world, I think we have the highest interest to somehow have a somewhat calming influence on the two superpowers, so to say, and try to tone down, let's say, the shriller parts of the rhetoric, and also try to secure the rules of the roads that we all need to feel secure and prosper. I think this is where the strategic convergence between Europe and India lies.
Yeah, no, that's very well said. I detect there is a bit of an asymmetrical treatment you are giving to Russia and China. So, dear viewers, I think we have run out of time. This has been a very interesting conversation. We have learnt and heard what the German perspective is on Ukraine, on the situation within Europe, the impact of the war on Germany, the relationship between the United States and Europe. And we've also talked to Mr. Saxer about how Europe views the rise of China. And I think there are some differences that we notice between the assessment that he has given us of how Europe looks at Russia and how Europe looks at China. But on the other hand, there is room for strategic convergence between India and Europe, because there are some issues that we can jointly tackle. So this was an interesting and an insightful conversation with a different perspective. And once again, I would like to thank you for joining us in this show, and I invite you to keep watching and following us in the future. And of course, I would also like to thank Mr. Marc Saxer.